Okay, well, if you'll just bear with me for a moment while I wait for my presentation to load on my end. I want to thank everyone for joining today. I see a list of attendees over here and people chatting. This is a nice interface, so I'll definitely take time for some questions after my lecture. I hope to not overburden you with too many slides. I am going to go through certain sections rather fast because I believe wow, 230 slides. So if a picture is worth 1,000 words, you're going to get 230,000 words from me right now. So I'll try to keep it at a good pace. But in today's lecture, basically what I'm touching on is not only the full derivative of things that I've learned up to this point, but also some of the newest research that I'm looking into around the Ark of the Covenant and how its possible origins around holding the Ten Commandments and the story being connected to the Exodus from Egypt might have some precursor stories that are extremely interesting involving the Great Pyramid of Giza. So I'm going to go ahead and just make my way through this, and please feel free to comment here if these don't work or if I'm doing something wrong, but hopefully everyone sees Gods of the Bible here. And let's see, I should be able to just go full screen. I'm not going to do that so I can see your comments. Okay. All right. So basically, as I started looking into some research around the Ark of the Covenant, some of the traditional biblical understandings of its usage and descriptions, I started to do research into various Renaissance age biblical artwork and finding actual physical Bibles that obtained that have imagery that we've been able to obtain that show either scenes of the Ark being used or referencing the Ark or demonstrating the same type of power that is usually seen with the Ark. So what you'll see here is a collection of images that are most widely known in Renaissance artwork as biblical scenes, but you can kind of see a theme that's happening here, which is things are always taking place in the sky, that there's events and beings and sometimes the conveyance of craft with wings and such, where things are happening in the sky. And that there was actually beings, of course, that came down from the sky. And so a lot of these stories in their traditional sense are very interesting. I, being raised as a Christian, always thought, wow, this is kind of interesting that there's something beyond Earth, but not enough to very substantiate. It was always kind of like heaven is just kind of up there. So where it kind of gets interesting is that you can see that there's this overall theme where not only are they seeing things in the sky in the conveyance of craft or actual human-like beings, but now they're being given knowledge from these beings. And scene after scene, this is being represented in many different cultures, biblical texts, as far as documenting the evidence for these interactions. So while a lot of this artwork might be symbolic in nature, and this artist, of course, she was very well known, there's a lot of symbology in a lot of this artwork, but I think it also speaks to a larger perspective. Now that we look into the past and try and make connections around the ancient astronaut theory, it's very clear that we can see representations of, again, a conveyance of flight, some knowledge that these people are actually either coming out of some type of a craft or have opened a doorway. But any of these large biblical figures are actually being surrounded with technology. So time after time, a lot of these things that we see have to do with their ability and how that medium exists that they communicated to the human beings. And so the human beings in their representation of the technology seem to be giving us hints of technology, meaning it's not magic. They were doing their best to represent what they saw, but our interpretation of it is not magic. It's technology. So again, a lot of these things, this is a famous scene of Christ on the cross. This is actually, I believe, a fresco on a church wall in Yugoslavia. And it was painted, I believe, in the 16th century. The point of that is it's really, really high up on the ceiling and it's hard to see. And if you get up there on a ladder, you'll look on the corners here, on the left and right corners of the image, and you see, again, a conveyance of a craft and a being actually piloting the craft. So over and over these scenes of the power of flight, throughout our history, I think is a question that speaks to where people of our type, human beings, flying around in the skies and earth in ancient times, possibly, but it appears that what we're seeing is an overriding pattern of them being able to replicate what they were seeing without maybe not even fully understanding the components of how it worked. So a lot of these conveyances of flight are enough of an impact to say, wow, it looks like, I guess, some kind of a craft. But they get very specific in nature. And so as we started to look into some of these more specific cultures, I was always very fascinated with the Sumerian culture, because all of the references in the Bible of Adam and Eve or the Garden of Eden, the idea that there were winged beings that they reference as angels, all of these references and many more are found in Sumerian epics that are at least 2,000 to 4,000 years earlier than the King James and the Old Testament Hebrew version. Probably the recorded original versions of some of these tales, like the Great Flood. So a lot of this information really started to resonate with me around their descriptions of these gods that came to visit the Sumerians, which they called the Anunnaki. Now, many of the artifacts that were pulled out of ancient Iraq, which was then called Sumer, Mesopotamia, Babylon, but specifically Sumer, they had a very ingenious system of conveying information. Not only did they have a written language called Sumerian cuneiform script, someone called a stylist would use an oversized screwdriver and could turn it and twist it into wet clay and make a document, a text document, and then they'd fire that into a kiln, a stove, literally keying that phrase right in stone. But accompanying their text, they had what we see here is the imprint of a cylinder seal. So they would take, also in the same clay that they write in, these round precious stones and could leave a positive impression. Let me go back. I have a few more of these we'll see, but it's a very interesting way to disseminate knowledge. So they had these perfectly carved reverse images that they would press over the clay to leave a positive surface and disseminate the pictures and the text throughout the city, like an old school newspaper, but very efficient. And you can see that, again, this depiction of the winged disc really is kind of prevalent in all of their artwork, and a lot of their pressings, cylinder seals, wall reliefs. It's kind of an overriding theme. And as we kind of jump, and forgive me, as I said, I'm going to jump around a little bit, folks. Now, this specific section we're looking at, I'm just kind of showing many instances that throughout the past, all these conveyances of flight, they did a pretty accurate job based on the knowledge they had. Now, this artist did a very excellent job. Again, this is the Madonna. I believe the artist is Saint Giovanni. And you can see that here, when we look at the picture, it's actually a cut-off version, but she's holding the baby Jesus down here. But as we zoom in, you can see that there's a gentleman over to the, let's see, maybe right side of your screen, is a gentleman holding his hands up, shielding his eyes, and there's a dog actually there as well. And they're both looking up at an object that appears to be emanating rays of energy of some kind. And this is very typical with all of the ufology sightings that we have today, is even with a camcorder, when we record it, it's basically just a ball of light, no matter how close we can zoom in. The reason why is because we're looking at a large energy discharge from a craft that is in a gaseous atmosphere. The byproduct of that is going to be photons, light. So the artist did a fairly accurate representation of showing, which even today is some type of UFO sighting. Now, again, this significance, going back to the Sumerian culture as another example for the power of flight, this is one of their gods, Inanna, also known as Ishtar, and she used to roam the skies of earth. A funny story from King Gilgamesh in one of his epic of creation tales. He commented that one time Ishtar invited him up to her sky abode, and he said, no thank you, because all of the previous men that you've invited to your sky abode never returned. So she used to like to roam the skies of earth, a very interesting artifact that shows, again, extreme detail in being able to see them create the conveyance of flight, or at least her representation of having the power of flight. Now, again, we've even seen this to cross into other cultures like Egypt. Some Ra and Isis and other symbols, Osiris and various other references that use the winged disc for a symbol of higher status, and many other references, in fact. But I like to tie it to basically that overriding knowledge of the power of flight. Now, some of the artifacts that they found in Egypt, one of these was found in an Egyptian governor's tomb. It was on display for many years as a bird model until a gentleman who was doing research looking at various other artifacts and cultures across cultures and how they had representations for the power of flight. This one actually is a plane. It's a representation of a plane. It has more characters intrinsic to a plane than that of a bird. The angle of the fin, the angle of the wing. So it's very interesting that we see a lot of these artifacts being shed into a new light. These coming out of Central America, again, with the same type of connection in Egypt, they were put on display as insect models. And again, you can see that these are very detailed and characteristic, made of solid gold. But under closer observation, they have what's more intrinsic to the characteristics of a modern day plane. The angle of the wing, the 90-degree tail fin. So seems very evident that, again, the ancient astronaut theory could be playing out here. And a simple example of that would be, we have another term for the ancient astronaut theory and more of a legitimized mainstream science view, which would be the cargo cult syndrome, which is, and it could be applied to, seeing extraterrestrials. Cargo cult syndrome simply is that World War I, World War II, Aboriginal tribes, all of a sudden American pilots show up in prop planes and land their prop plane and get out of the plane, light up a cigarette. Aboriginal comes up to him with a spear and he's like, "Who are you?" And he holds out a voice recorder and records the Aboriginal's voice while he's smoking a cigarette and plays it back to him. The Aboriginal can't believe that he's like caught the guy's spirit somehow. He hears his own voice. He sees the plane. He thinks it's a living object. He doesn't understand that it's a machine. So a funny thing starts to happen. The soldiers set up camp and they start to receive drop shipments from planes. They're there for 2-3 months at a time, let's say. So they receive these shipments on a regular basis. So these large planes fly over, huge parachute opens up, and a big thing of cargo opens up. It was dropped. Now, sometimes these shipments wouldn't land in the soldiers' camp. They'd drift and land in one of the tribes or near one of the camps, of the tribe. So the tribe would crack it open, and it's full of knives and guns and food. And so they literally thought these were like shipments from the gods, or supreme other beings. They didn't understand. Soldiers eventually pack up their stuff and leave, and an interesting phenomenon happens. They create perfect replica models out of straw, and twigs, and branches of these prop planes, scrape away runways, clearing the runways that the soldiers initially made for the planes to land, and sit there for hours, looking at the skies, hoping to lure back these amazing gifts that they were receiving from the skies. So, this is the same scenario that we can see played out in other epochs of time, where the ancient astronaut theory has been played out many times, where just like this artifact you see here, they were very good at recording what they were seeing without maybe not fully understanding its true function. This one is a very interesting artifact in display, I believe, in a Turkish museum. It was actually put on display by Zachariah Sitchin, bugging the curator of the museum to say, "Look, I know you don't agree with me that it's a rocket ship, but why don't you let your visitors, decide?" And so he actually got them to put it on display for a limited time, like an exhibit, as the headless rocket ship with like a question mark, But if you look at the characteristics of this, it's very similar to our retired space shuttle. Speaking on that, I hope all of you just might have got to see the SpaceX landing. I'm here in California, so about 20 miles, no, not even 20 miles, 10 miles north of me here in Newport to Huntington, and about 200 miles out, they did a landing on an inflatable cargo of the SpaceX rocket just about 30 minutes ago, I believe, something like that. And that was a successful landing. So very interesting. Again, the descriptions that ancient man was able to replicate in some of their artifacts, I think, are very significant in how much they were able to convey with accuracy what they were seeing. Clearly, this looks like some type of a rocket ship. You can see the gentleman's knees are even bent at the knee there, and he's just unfortunately missing his head, but then we see thrusters in the back that, very reminiscent of a modern rocket ship. Okay, now, some of the artifacts that we have on display is a very interesting set around the world that show a conveyance of an understanding of technology. This is the Antikythera mechanism. It's found off the coast of Antikythera near Greece. And when under under radar, they were able to see that this contains somewhere between 35 to 70 interweaving cogs and wheels. It's a very intricate machine that was encased in a box at one point, and they felt that it served two functions. Function number one was that it was used as an astrological device. So if someone could essentially tune the device to your birth date and say, oh, well, the planets are going to align at these certain times, and you'll be best suited to carry out certain things at certain times. The other purpose was an astronomical device, which would allow the user to navigate, perhaps tuning to a certain star or something of that magnitude, and being able to navigate knowing the movements of the heavens based on this calibrated box. So very interesting piece of technology that has been found recently, not recently, but it was early 1900s. Now, this one's still open for debate, and I wish I could reach back over my shoulder here and pick it up for you, but I am mic'd, and that's probably not safe. But what we have in Egypt in a certain area there is a crypt called Dendera, and it's literally known as the light-giving source. There's two pieces of information in Dendera that are given to us. One is a wall relief on the wall that shows a map of the heavens 8,000 years, well, 6,000 years before the traditional culture. Essentially, it's around 8,000 years old of when the sky and the positions and what positions the stars were in around 8,000 years ago. Now, that's pretty heavy considering that the Egyptian culture is supposed to be around 2500 BC. This goes well beyond their time frame, that they're charting the stars of how they would have looked in the heavens well into their past, or maybe they were around much further than we currently understand. We'll come back to that. The second part of Dendera, this area known as the light-giving source, has a lot of these wall reliefs like you see here, which some people to interpret is an actual lamp, some conveyance of light. Excuse me. There's some conveyance of light, and modern archaeologists say that, well, they're holding up the lotus flower, symbolic reference of the lotus flower, and that bloom, that flume of filament that you see with a little snake in the middle is just the aroma of the lotus flower. Okay, that's fine. But if you look closely at this image, you can see that not only does it look like a light bulb, but it appears to be even plugged into some type of a device. Every one of these images, you can see that it's actually plugged into some type of a jedge pillar or something that would look like a modern day transistor or some type of harness of energy. Now, what's really interesting about the Dendera bulb is that all over Egypt in these crypts and tombs, there's rarely ever any evidence of soot, of flame being carried through the tombs. There's no evidence of a lot of soot on the ceiling. So how are they able to carve these intricate wall reliefs, hieroglyphics, and stone carvings without the use of light? Now, modern Egyptologists say that it was either flame or that they used copper mirrors to reflect the light into the, to the passages to get where they needed. So another idea is very simple. Exactly what they see is that they had low-level electricity and were able to generate the light. Now, what's interesting about this topic is I actually had a bulb made on the Dendera spec and filled it with a low plasma energy, basically like you've heard a misidentified swamp gas sighting, a UFO sighting. It was ignited swamp gas. Well, the Egyptians would have had the same access to methane gas naturally emitted from the ground, from a swamp or what have you, probably near the Nile, all over the place, that would allow them to capture that, and with a low energy discharge, just a low amount of electricity could easily generate phosphorescence. And if you look over my left shoulder, I actually have the bulb you see on camera right back there on the shelf. And right above it, as we'll come to in a moment, is the power source, which is a Baghdad battery. Now, a modern day flashlight takes 9 volts, let's say. You can power one of these with around 4 volts. And you can easily get enough light to fill it in a dark room to see what you're doing on a wall. Now, the Baghdad battery is a very interesting component to this because it's found in the same time frame of around 2500 BC. And it's very interesting. They found about a dozen of these so far. And essentially, it's just a clay pot with a copper filling and an iron rod. And they usually use an asphalt, like a rubbery stopper, to kind of seal it. And if you stick any weak acidic acid, wine, vinegar, grape juice, you actually generate positive electrons. So I actually have a couple of those back here on my shelf as replicas. And I'm sorry, the image is so small. Maybe you can zoom in on my camera. But these on camera, I was able to generate 4 volts with one that's about just over 6 inches tall. And I easily got a current of 4 volts. Now, there's mine on the shelf, an enlarged image. Now, what's interesting about these is that 4 volts from around 6 inches, some of the vials we see in Egypt are around 6 to 9 feet tall. And the only explanation they can say for the Baghdad battery was that they were using it to change the change the way you could like spray jewelry with, a fine gold or something, and heat it up and change its properties. But another analogy also accepted was, which is kind of funny, is, they had competing churches. And so one of the ideas is that they would be able to create a static charge buildup in some of these statues. And so as you would enter the church, you would actually see or feel a buzz coming from the statue, and when you went up to touch it, it would give you like a static discharge, like, oh, the power of the gods, a little trick by the priest. But the other theory is that these were able to actually harness much more voltage, more like if I got 4 volts out of a 6-inch one, a 7-foot, maybe you can get 60, 70 volts. Now you're talking about some significant wattage. So it's a very interesting hypothesis to understand that there's a lot of lower level technology, especially when I look at the comments here, electricity is old tech. Yes, it is. So let's just not put the bar there. Let's not just say the Egyptians were, wow, they had light bulbs. Good for them. No, it doesn't stop there. It turns out that there's some crossovers with some of the knowledge that we have coming out of Egypt, and some of these stories that we have around certain pharaohs and their exodus of Egypt, certain key figures and their exodus of Egypt, and some crossovers of the story. Now, I'm still working on some of the pieces to lay out the differences between Akhenaten and Moses, or were they actually the same person? But it turns out there's quite a bit of evidence to show that Akhenaten, who was one of the first pharaohs of Egypt, that upheld a different set of rules around his dynasty and didn't believe in many different gods. He believed in one god, the Aten, the sun, the Eten, A-T-E-N. And what's really interesting about Akhenaten is that he seems to have been not only access to a different set of principles, but also probably a different realm and handed down ideas of technology. So a lot of the crossovers that we have with Akhenaten and Moses seem to reflect around the time frame as to when they both had their exodus and they both took their people with them. The interesting crossover is there seems to be a discrepancy behind what the true purpose was of the exodus. Now, in Moses' story, we have him leaving with the Israelites and taking them to the base of the mountain, where at some point Moses goes up, gets the 10 Commandments, comes down, and now we have the Ark of the Covenant appear in the story. 10 Commandments are put in there, story continues. Now, it turns out in the other legend, very similar to Moses' story, is Akhenaten, who also left Egypt, but possibly took a large golden box supported by 2 poles on each side with him. This golden box also seems to have the exact same dimensions for the grand sarcophagus in the Great Pyramid of Giza. So there seems to be a connection between the Ark of the Covenant and how it has the exact same dimensions to fit right into what we would call the Great Sarcophagus in the Pyramid of Giza. But maybe it's not a sarcophagus. Maybe this is a large energy plant, and the Ark of the Covenant is the battery. Now, if Akhenaten left with the large battery of Egypt, of course the reigning pharaoh, who might have been Ramses the first, Ramses the second, depending on the time frames, would of course want to come after him and say, "Give me back my battery," because not only are we talking about a power, but we're talking about something that could have been a power and technology well beyond our current understanding. But we do know that around the world, not only Giza, there is what we would call an ancient world energy grid. Stonehenge, Nazca, Machu Picchu, various sites that are on geodetic points seems to have an upwelling of certain, what we call today, subtle energies. So Giza might have been one of these locations that was resonating this subtle energy that we call today for some other purpose. Point being, what I'm going to show you in this new research is there seems to be something that says the crossover between Akhenaten and Moses has some validation, and that the story of the Ark goes well beyond the Jewish tradition of just the Exodus. Okay, so most of you are familiar with the traditional story of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Ark. But what we also have here is a symbolic reference to how the Ark is carried and how it's always dressed. It's always known to be something of great power. While this was a symbolic reference of the Ark's power, I think they did a pretty good job of saying why you don't want to mess with the Ark of the Covenant under the wrong circumstances. And even in modern media, the way we convey the power of the Ark is something that it has great energy. It's a very large energy source. Could it also be a communication device with God of some sort, or some higher dimension, or higher being? But as you can see, that even in the movie, while this guy is about to be toast, you can see that symbolically they did a very good job of accurately displaying what I've also found out to be validated by looking at various different biblical sources and how they convey the interaction with the Ark on a serious note. So you can see here that the actor has a staff, he's wearing a robe, and most importantly, he's wearing a chest plate with 12 emeralds. Now, this is a theme that seems to be carried through as a certain type of dress, radiation shielding of some sort, something that's always worn and spoken of, that if you approach the Ark in the wrong way, if you touch it in the wrong way, you die. Now, what's interesting is that, pre-Exodus stories in the Jewish tradition, what we find throughout Egypt are references of the Ark all over Egypt. And more specifically, a lot of the things that we find in the Ten Commandments found in precursor texts all over Egypt. The Dead Sea, not the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and many other places where it's inscribed essentially the same Ten Commandments, but in an Egyptian dialect well before the Exodus from Egypt. So it seems that there are precursor events following the Jewish tradition and an understanding of the power and usage for the Ark of the Covenant in Egypt. All over Egypt, there again are these references of this great type of box where there was a connection that the Pharaoh had access to it or used it. In the movie Stargate, they got in this large box and was able to regenerate or somehow become healed instantly. But it's very interesting that we have these reliefs over and over, not only in Egypt, but in other cultures, that show the Ark being carried always with a certain type of headdress, certain type of chest plate and wardrobe. So here even I found a stock image, I believe, on some site that was, again, just for artwork purposes, but very accurately showing someplace in Egypt where, again, they have the idea of the same conveyance of the Ark being in use. Now, the conveyance of the Ark takes on different forms too. Like, I'm not sure if it's exactly just a communication device or an energy source, but it's also sometimes a conveyance being shown as something that they're either traveling with or assisting their travel where they go to. I don't exactly know. But what's interesting about that is that a lot of these times it seems to be a preparation for the afterlife. That somehow they're tapping into another gateway or access where the pharaoh is prepared in the mummy state and some of these things that they think is the afterlife. Maybe this is an actual, again, cargo cult or ancient astronaut representation of something they saw, misunderstood, and are now replicating as a traditional practice, ritual practice. So when we look at the evidence for the sarcophagus in the king's chamber, what we see first of all is nothing resembling a king's chamber. If it was a king's chamber prepared for burial, we would see his eminence inscribed all over the walls to his praise. We see nothing like that. All we see is blocks, crystalline blocks, crystal and quartz fit so perfectly that you can't even fit a credit card in between the cracks. It's almost as if they were using this room to pass large amounts of energy through it. The dimensions of the sarcophagus seem to fit the exact cubit dimensions biblically for the Ark of the Covenant, so much so that you could literally just fit the Ark. It would kind of just lower itself right in there. Now, this raises a lot of questions about the uses of the Ark of the Covenant. If it's being conveyed and showed properly, it was a large energy source. And being able to power the Great Pyramid was a purpose that we seem to know existed. Christopher Dunn wrote a great book called Giza, the Power Plant. I believe it was the Power Plant, something like that. The Giza, the Great Power Plant, something like that. Christopher Dunn's a great engineer and has looked at many different aspects for the engineering purposes of the tunnel ways and the way they've sculpted the rooms. A lot of the machining and things that were needed to create these not only blocks, but the actual math that aligns these things is so perfect and precise, it boggles modern day engineers. So a lot of evidence points to the fact that Giza was not just a place that was a burial for the pharaohs, but that the pyramids, the Great Pyramid specifically, was harnessing some type of energy. There's actually waterways too that come up from the Nile into passageways and cause a pulse just on basic tidal changes from low tide to high tide and seasonal changes that create a pulsing effect of the water, where this also creates a static charge buildup, that they could somehow be tapping into energy or doing things with the pyramid that we still don't fully understand. But it's pretty clear that the pyramid in itself was a great artifact, but the Ark is still something of a great mystery, and we don't know the true location of the Ark. It could be in Ethiopia, it could be like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, stored away in some underground warehouse under the Vatican or something. But the point of it is to look at history's documentation visually and also understand in context what it was being used for. So what I did again was just take a sliver of information looking at only the biblical versions showing information about the Ark, which we'll see in a minute here, but also kind of diving further into Egypt and finding references of information that discuss or talk about the lineage of the Ark through different dynasties. And there are some researchers in Egypt looking around the background of Akhenaten and the split off between the information between the tract of Moses and the tract of Akhenaten and looking at the differences. I was recently interviewing someone named Dr. Zaki Hawass, who is the director of the antiquities the director for the Giza plateau having to do with antiquities for like 20 years. He's now retired from that, but in the last 20 years, if you saw a CBS or ABC or NBC special on Egypt about some tomb or a mummy, hands down, it was Dr. Zaki Hawass doing the interview. Now, Dr. Zahi Hawass just recently uncovered the tomb of Akhenaten's wife, which is a very interesting connection in that we now know that King Tut, Tutankhamun, that famous pharaoh, a young pharaoh, well, Akhenaten was his father, right? So now they found King Tut's mother as well. But not a lot of not a lot of light, excuse me, is shed on the story of Akhenaten. And again, folks, it's a very interesting line of information. I'm probably going to touch on some of it in my lecture, but it spawns into a new realm of how I look at our past, which is that there's a lost cycle of time. The further we look back into the epochs of time, we see that the ancients tracked the cycles of time like using the heavens as a large celestial clock. They broke down the heavens into 12 constellations, and we move through those constellations using, again, the heavens as a marker. We move through those ages, each 12 of those, we move through each one every 2,000 years. So if you figure there's 12 of them, and each cycle, each age lasts 2,000 years, there's a 24,000-year cycle, which we now call the precession of the equinox. All the ancients somehow tracked this knowledge, and it shows that they were aware that we seem to go through cycles of change that are cyclical here on Earth. That seems to be logical, right? Just like the seasons are cyclical. So there seems to be a cycle of time where we go into the dark ages, forget everything, and then we go to these great feats called the Golden Age, and we have heightened knowledge, heightened awareness, probably heightened interaction with higher beings, and then we dip back into the dark ages and forget everything. We've just now come back out of those dark ages, going back up towards another Golden Age. Golden Age probably won't be for another 8,000 years, looking at how you look at this 24,000-year cycle of time. I'm going to touch on some of that in my lecture, but the whole reason why I'm bringing it up, folks, is that Akhenaten is from that lost Golden Age. He is so far back in the past from one of the first dynastic views of Egypt that his reign was holding on to that last time that we were in the Golden Age, probably 10 to 13,000 years ago, probably around the true time of when the pyramids were built. So a lot of things come into alignment with the understanding that there's a larger cycle of time, and that some of these key players that we still have access to are holding on or held on to this higher knowledge that, once again, we're just now starting to re-piece back together. Okay, so the Ark, again, as far as its physical descriptions and a lot of the biblical texts that we have, seem to be very much in alignment with it being a large energy source. It's always emanating a large amount of power. So over and over, what we see are the conveyance of different cultures: Greek, Roman, Ethiopian, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Hindu, various cultures all having references to the power of the Ark of the Covenant and some of the acts that took place with its presence. Now, again, some of the traditional views in the Exodus and the Jewish tradition in the Old and New Testament around the Ark of the Covenant were that it was more of a communication source with God, and that you were able to be in God's presence, what have you, using the Ark of the Covenant. But again, note the priests and how their wardrobe looks very similar and congruent. It's always the same type of outfit that they wear as they go through the different views of the interaction with the Ark. So different cultures all have this shared knowledge of the vast power of the Ark. And again, it seems to have a much deeper origin than just coming out of the Exodus story of Egypt, that it was being somehow harnessed to a great capacity by some of these older cultures. Now, sometimes too, it's also, as I mentioned, used as some kind of conveyance, as a gateway. They're either traveling with it or they use it to open a gateway of some sort. And again, notice the plate on his chest always being in prominence, that they had some type of radiation shielding or protection. And I actually did some tests with the History Channel, which I'll probably have some pictures of that, where we analyzed some of this information, so that we did a test on camera with a physicist here at the University of California, Irvine, and built a replica of the Ark, and noticed that the way it's constructed is that you have to touch it at certain points to stay grounded. And if not, it's just like touching a live wire, like a telephone pole or something, that has an exposed wire. You don't want to do that. So there's physical instructions and descriptions around the dress and mannerisms needed to approach the Ark. So again, I found this very interesting, that it was across cultures: Saudi Arabian, Israel, Roman, Egyptian, many different cultures had the same respect and understandings for how you stood and approached the ark. Now, the true purpose of what they were doing with the ark, again, is something that we're going to have to vet out further, but there are some clear connections to it being used in Egypt as a large energy source. And as someone, commented earlier about, electricity is old tech, I would agree with you, because the super old tech seems to be even more amazing, is that they were using a way to harness energy globally in this, world energy grid. And there might have been artifacts like the Ark of the Covenant at key locations that were somehow allowing them to harness or transmit this energy in ways that we just don't understand fully. But again, the conveyance of how it's carried was always shown with the two poles, and always very protective. And again, with certain people that weren't in the highest positions transporting the ark, as you see here, we're given very specific instructions that if you touch it in a certain way, you will die. And of course, some people, don't listen. So again and again, we start to see references of the ark not only being used as a gateway, but also starting to be used as a great weapon. Something that showed, again, that it had a great amount of power and that could stand before any army and allow them to just wipe them out. Okay. A lot of these scenes, again, start to raise the question about, why would Akhenaten, for example, if he was leaving and take the ark with him, it wouldn't have been just a big battery, obviously, right? It would have had multi-purposes. And this is another side note, but it was brought to my attention by one of my colleagues, Walter Cruttenden, a fellow researcher, that a lot of the other visuals that we see for the gods, especially the Sumerians, Mayans, Aztecs, a lot of them seem to be carrying what looks like a purse. And sometimes they're also holding what's known as the cone, a little tree of life reference. But a lot of them have this conveyance of a purse. And what seems to be interesting about this is there's a connection with this that has to do with something that, let's call it modern references of Mary Poppins and her purse, right? She could pull all kinds of magic stuff out of her purse. Felix the cat, right? The cartoon, in his little purse that he could like open a bag and just have tricks, So there seems to be a conveyance of gods having the ability to, at an atomic level or at the ability to manipulate matter, a conveyance for that, an actual visual to say, I'm at a status where I have the ability to manipulate matter or play at that level. And there are Hindu references to some of this information as well that kind of explain this further. And then we see these playing out in other cultures where I can make connections like Mayan and Aztec, and of course this Sumer. So a lot of these pieces, like the Ark, it's interesting to see that they have a large conveyance of energy. But just like Mary Poppins in her magic bag, she was able to pull out multiple things. The Ark could have multiple purposes that they were able to access or do things depending on how they harnessed its energy. Okay, so this was kind of what I was touching on briefly as a side note, a little bit prematurely, is that in a lot of the research that I've started to do, first starting to look at Sumer, and then as we, do shows like Ancient Aliens now in its 9th season. I think I just shot some series episodes last week, and it's interesting. The more and more we look at these sites, Göbekli Tepe or Indonesia Valley, or now we're going to be looking deeply into China. The further and further back we go, the more complex the sites become. So it's really starting to tip the scholars thinking on their heads, like, well, how does this happen? We don't explain. And, they look at individual case scenarios from different cultures, but they don't look at all of the cultures and try and look at the bigger picture. So the bigger picture from my standpoint is all of the cultures, Mesoamerica, Mayan, Aztec, South America, Central, and some of these locations. And then we had the Egyptians and Sumerian in Iraq, ancient Iraq. All of them went to great lengths to monitor the heavens and track the movements of the stars. And they seem to be aware of a much larger cycle of time. So what I'd like to do is kind of explain that to you in our session today, is that several different cultures used a reference of even Greek Roman, different references, both same meaning, called it the Great Year. And you can see here that there are different cultures. The outer one is Greek Roman, most commonly known today as the Iron, Bronze, Silver, Golden Age. And then we have the Hindu, and we have the Satya Yuga, the Treta Yuga, the Dwapara Yuga, and then the Kali Yuga. And so then in the golden track in the inner part there, we have the symbolic references of the cycle. Now, folks, what's really interesting about this is that it doesn't matter what continent you go to, China, Africa, India, Americas, we all have the same knowledge of this breakdown of the heavens into a divisible 12 parts. And there seems to be a mathematical breakdown that they use to calculate when events are going to take place. And things seem to happen on a repeating cycle. The kicker of this is this cycle is a 24,000 year cycle. So what there seems to be happening is a repeating of a lot of the events that have already taken place. Meaning, if you look at this image here, 2000 AD was, roughly just coming out of the Iron Age and into the Bronze Age. We're unfortunately quite a bit away before we're into the Golden Age again. But you can already see and feel these changes happening. 2012 wasn't a marker as an age of time ending for all time. It was an age of time that was the Aquarian age. Or excuse me, it was at the time of the age of Pisces ending, and we entering the age of Aquarius. It's just an astronomical marker of those 12 divisions of the heavens broken down. The ancients used this systematically and built structures and monitored the heavens, which I'll show you, very accurately, and knew that somehow there were influences in the universe or in our solar system that caused the rise and fall of civilization here on Earth. So not getting too specific on that part, because I know it's a heavy concept. Just understand that a lot of the great cultures out there realized that there was this larger cycle of time. Today we call it the precession of the equinox. What I'm going to show you tonight is new information that spins this information into a more clear light. All the latest data for calculating the precession of the equinox. The old model is called the lunar solar model, where they basically say that because of the moon's influence and the way we orbit, there's this squishing of the Earth, and it causes a retarding of about 1 degree every 72 years, so that around 2,000 years later, boom, we're facing a different North Star. The variables and complications in this lunar solar theory are so complex for torsion and motion and torque and all this. Much more simplified version has come out, less variables, and it makes a lot more sense. Our solar system is not a static solar system where the sun is sitting there and we're spinning around it. No, our sun is actually moving through space. I say that because all of the other solar systems that we've been viewing with our telescopes, looking at other external parts of the galaxy, we see what's called a binary system very prevalent, that most other solar systems we film have somewhere between 2 to 3, sometimes 4 or even more suns and different planets all intertwined in this amazing dance. So the idea that there's a binary sun, 2 suns, is nothing new. And all the evidence has been stacking up from topics like Planet X or Nibiru that can support that model by us having a second sun. So there's a lot of evidence, not only in our modern technology and science around a Planet X, an additional sun, well beyond the Oort cloud, which is another asteroid belt far beyond Pluto, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we have a second sun. But it's a dark star now. It's a failed sun. It's a brown dwarf. It's not emanating a lot of heat or light, but it is a big gravity source. So there's a large amount of information that shows we are actually a binary solar system. Now, folks, that doesn't mean 2 suns sitting stagnant in space, right? Let me get back on camera. That means binary. They're in orbit around each other. So when the suns get close to each other, we spin up faster, and then as they get farther away, it slows down. This seems to be a 24,000 year cycle. And when the suns are at their closest point, there seems to be a connection with us being in the golden age. When the suns are at their farthest point, we're in the dark ages. There's something that happens, and I'm only going to try and give you the best tangible examples, is think about the sun's energy and how it affects us. Just one sun. It makes all the flowers and things spring to life towards the direction of the sun. Everything wakes up and enjoys the energy of the sun. Everything slows down without the sun. Now, what if we introduce the electromagnetism or some other energy sources from another sun, a foreign body of electromagnetism that gives us awakening or does something to us that we just don't understand yet? It seems to be the case, folks, that all the ancients were aware of some type of other energy that was naturally available in these golden ages when we're in this other cycle of time. And so it might be that we built a lot of these monuments to harness this energy as we started to dip out of the golden age. Heavy topics, but I at least want you to understand the scenario of some of the things I'm trying to convey in today's lecture. Okay. So as you can see here, it's kind of an illustration that most of the stars that we see in our solar system today are in fact binary. This information can be challenged at an academic level. My partner runs something called the Binary Research Institute here at Newport Beach, and has used the same NASA or personnel that would be working for daytime at JPL or Goddard Space Center or some conglomerate of NASA. But at nighttime and freelance can crunch the data for a different model using their same astrophysics and mathematics background. So the Binary Research Institute, which can be Googled, has produced a wealth of information looking at the scientific aspects for the precession of the equinox based on it being, again, this larger cycle of time that seems to repeat, and understanding that if our sun, grasp this folks, if our sun is in orbit around another sun, that means we're moving through space. We're orbiting the sun. So if the sun's moving through space, we're going along for the ride. That explains a whole other view of why we see a different star passing over us every 2,000 years. It's not because there's a wobble in the moon. It's because our orientation is actually changing in three-dimensional space as we travel in this binary orbit with the sun around our other sun. So heavy concept, but makes a much more logical approach based on all the current data. Again, so visual representation that all the ancients broke down the heavens into 12 parts so that you were able to visually look at the heavens as a large celestial clock. Now, it didn't take a lot of science to actually know what age you were in. The ancients had a very simple way. You could go out right at the time just before sunrise, look towards the sun, and whatever constellation that the sun is going to be rising in front of, you're in the age of Aquarius, the age of Pisces, based on the constellation that was behind the sun. So they had a very easy way of understanding and tracking this time, but went to great lengths to memorialize it in different edifices and actually large monuments that just align perfectly tracking this. Various cultures from around the planet seem to have the same understanding and use the same symbolic references to denote this understanding. Let me give you a real world example. If you drive around the United States, especially in more of the middle parts of the United States, you'll see on the back of people's cars what looks like the symbol of a fish, and sometimes a little cross inside that fish. Folks, before Jesus, that symbol, a fish, symbolized the age of Pisces, an astronomical symbol which cultures preceding the time of Jesus used the symbol of a fish to denote the age of Pisces. The age of Pisces, symbolically being a fish, coordinates with the time of Jesus and his reign that just took place for the last 2,000 years. Spiritually speaking, we've crossed now into the age of Aquarius, and everyone sees there's a new awakening and understanding around these spiritual topics. That's why at 41 years old, I'm talking to you on a web conference about this information, because when I was 20, just in that time period, 20 years, this information was taboo. I could not get a degree talking about this information. This is not still accepted in academic circles, but everyone knows the truth. So the circle of information continues to grow, and it's very interesting to look at how all the ancients around the world seem to go through this same cycle of, we go to great lengths of learning this in the golden age, and then lose it all in the Dark Ages and start to relearn it. I'll show you some more specific examples of this, but just again, jumping off topic because it's popping into my head, you can see the track record of some of this astronomically, that if you look at the knowledge of, let's say, our orbiting the sun, right? So the Sumerians and the Egyptians all had very accurate knowledge that they knew we orbited the sun. I mean, they had very accurate knowledge of our position of the heavens going back thousands of years. But now we get to the time of Copernicus and Galileo. We somehow, by that time, have lost the knowledge about us orbiting the sun, and they're just relearning it and proving to everyone else, guys, look, we orbit the sun. They're like, no, it's not possible. Vatican couldn't be lying. So you can see just in that time frame of how we didn't know a lot of the information about orbiting the sun. We relearned it, and now today, of course, it's a standard norm. Just as we're learning about this lost cycle of time, there are certain variables about the information we're learning about ancient cultures that the time of the Sumerians and the Egyptians, this was all well known. Copernicus, Galileo, we come out of the Dark Ages. We've just been relearning all of this stuff, folks, and it's going to continue to happen. Okay, so as you can see, that based on a lot of the evidence, there seems to be an understanding that we're actually in a binary orbit. Now, if you just calculated the sun's moving at one speed, there'd be discrepancies in the orbit. So we have to calculate the fact that the gravitational size, based on the weight and size of this other sun, which we haven't validated even what it is it Sirius A and B? Maybe, we don't know. But that orbit causes it to go like this. It speeds up as they get closer and then slows down as they get farther apart. So this is something that we're still looking at and tracking. But a lot of the ancient cultures, again, went to great lengths to convey their astronomical information. Here's an edifice of a Sumerian stela that shows various astronomical symbols. Here's the great renowned Tower of Babel incident. But let's look closer, folks, at the top. And what do we see? Two suns, a knowledge of two suns. And a lot of the ancient cultures seem to speak of the idea and an understanding that the sun had a twin and that there was two suns. Okay. Now again, so when we start to look at some of this Egyptian information about their astronomical data, they were very accurate in being able to convey large concepts. Hieroglyphics are very interesting. I recommend anyone look at the work of Dr. Laird Scranton. He makes understanding hieroglyphics very easy. A hieroglyphic, just one symbol alone, is like an acronym, like CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. Lots of laughs, right? LOL. These things are acronyms, where one hieroglyphic is an acronym. It has multiple word meaning. So when you see hieroglyphics strung together, they are actually conveying multiple words with multiple meanings. Very ingenious way of communicating. One of the things that they left us was this stela on top of the Dendera wall on the ceiling, which actually shows a view of the heavens from at least 8,000 years ago. Now, what's interesting about this view is that they show all of the current constellations that we're aware of, but many others that we're not aware of. A much older view of the heavens, which we still can't even identify what they were seeing, but we know for a fact, based on our own knowledge of how the solar system moves, this is a very old view, around 8,000 years old. Here's an up-close version. You can see the detail in the design. Now, what's interesting is you can use an iPad or various other programs today, and it will tell you, running star charts, Redshift, various other programs that are free, and it'll tell you, oh, look, if you're in North America, go out tonight at 9 p.m. and you'll see Orion 27 degrees to the north. Well, you can run these programs not only forward in time to know where the constellations are going to be, but using that same model back in time. And it turns out that a lot of the alignments that take place, for instance, the three great pyramids of Giza, they align perfectly with the Orion constellation at 10,500 BC. I think I'm probably going to have some images of that. But a lot of the data seems to explain why they had knowledge of a much older epoch of time. Either they existed or that they understood somehow that there were these cycles of time and were tracking it so accurately, they understood the movements of the heavens, far beyond what we do today. Now, the Dark Ages, unfortunately, is that time frame where it's kind of symbolically shown like we see in Game of Thrones, right? Everything's about the physical presence. Hoarding. What can I physically gain? No spiritual, like, you're like, hey man, understand peace and loving. They'd be like, I take your stuff. So unfortunately, the Dark Ages were an age of very little spiritual understanding. And that's something that we've just dipped out of coming out of the Dark Ages. The Golden Age is kind of this understanding that there seems to be a time when man reaches a height. The ancient Hindus say that man reaches a point where he's actually able to interpret God. We're nowhere near that. So there's such a leap in understanding, and I probably have an image of this, but I'm saying it ahead of time, so forgive me. To understand this 24,000 year cycle, we have to understand how just insignificantly small our lifespan is at 100 years. So an analogy of that would be, there's an insect here on Earth called the mayfly, and it only lives 24 hours. Its whole gestation period of birth to death, 24 hours. So if a mayfly is born on a cloudy, windless day and is sitting on a leaf, and another mayfly comes up and he's like, I've heard of this stuff called the sun, sunshine, or wind. I don't see it. And they both die. Now that doesn't mean that the sun and the wind don't exist, right? All of the ancient cultures went to great lengths to explain that they all had these heightened states and were tracking when they were in that heightened state and when they will return, when the gods will return, when they will be in alignment again. So it seems to have a very deep impact on our current understandings if we can only get our heads around it. But there seems to have been a time when we were at such a heightened state that not only could we interpret God, but maybe we were also interacting with other beings interdimensionally, extraterrestrial. And as we dip back into these darker ages, of course, our friends in space, as an example, wouldn't be like, oh, let's go talk to the monkeys. Let's give them another cycle, and they evolve again. So it's very interesting to see how there's this connection with all the ancient cultures with these higher beings, and now today we're looking around going, well, where are they? So maybe there is just this track record that seems to be a cycle that takes place as to when we have the interactions, and us being the right, literally spiritual mind frame to be ready to globally accept this type of knowledge. Okay, we already saw that image. So other cultures, again, track this knowledge. Even Arabic texts, various cultures that had this understanding and recorded it and looked at this different view, that there was an importance to understanding the position in this larger cycle of time. Various cultures recorded on various types of technology, from metal plates to papyrus or stone. The Sumerian culture, one of my favorite cultures, had that ingenious method of reverse carving images so they could press it into various objects and leave multiple imprints. This one I just thought was interesting because what you see here is actually a symbolic reference of Earth and the main, the symbol of Nibiru, essentially. So here we have the planet Nibiru, was like the home world of the gods of the Sumerians, the Anunnaki. We have a cross, and its large moon, Kingu, the moon of Nibiru, and then we have Earth, the 7 dots of Earth, the sacred number 7, key. Earth is always represented as the 7 dots, and it has its moon with it, its crescent moon. So I always thought that was just kind of an interesting seal. Now, what's interesting about the Sumerian culture, again, is their style of writing. They had this cuneiform script, which, again, was kind of a large, oversized screwdriver. They would turn it and twist it in the clay and make these characters. They'd also write sometimes on semi-precious stones, and recorded not only daily events of like, I trade you so many things of barley for a donkey, what have you, but they also recorded astronomical information. And in some of these tablets, they recorded information over thousands of years. A lot of these tablets are actually on display in various museums, and others are not on display, meaning they're literally, shoved in a drawer or in a locker. There are literally thousands of tablets still in the Louvre and in the British Museum that just need the proper grants to, access academically and translate. There could be certain plants and penicillins and things that could help the body, or things that we don't understand based on the wealth of information, wealth of information that they've left us astronomically. Sorry for the feedback, folks. Little neck scratch. Now, again, other cultures have this knowledge of this larger cycle of time, and the Mayans were a great example where they were put out of context with not fully understanding the right context, that their 2012 calendar didn't end in 2012. It was just an age ending, just like any clock will tick into a new time frame. So one of their calendars, they actually had 3 calendars, 3 different ways how they track time. One of them was a long count calendar. It's more of like a prediction-based calendar, And what's interesting about their prediction-based calendars, it made more long-term predictions. They weren't always accurate. One of their Baktuns predicted a time frame for when their god Kukulkan was going to return. The same time frame for Kukulkan's return, one day this huge ship with white sails and these people with gleaming armor and amazing wardrobes step off and greet the Mayans in a very honorable way. And they think it's Kukulkan's crew. And they're like, wow, here we go. The gods have returned. Bring out the gold, bring out the women, bring out the food. You guys are it. Here you go. Have everything. Take our culture. And that's exactly what they did. And they took all of their Mayan codices and left us for after burning everything and aggressively converting everybody to Christianity. So unfortunately, what we have is information left from various cultures that tap into this lost higher knowledge from the Golden Age, whether it be Mayan, Aztec, Hindu, Sumerian, African, Australian. They all seem to have been influenced by some lost great culture. Today, as an analogy, we would say there was an Atlantis, some great culture on a continent that sunk. Well, no. In fact, there was a great culture, but it probably was global and influenced all the cultures at that time. And so now all the great ancient cultures that we have today, they all have a piece. They all have the same piece of being influenced by that great race, that great culture that existed in our last golden age, probably, again, 10,000 BC, let's just roughly say 10 to 13,000 years ago, something like that. Okay, so the Mayans, again, in their long count calendar, the way they track time is just very advanced and understood larger cycles of time. How we're just now starting to acknowledge and understand that the precession of the equinox probably isn't caused by a wobble. It's caused by us being in a binary orbit. And this, again, just changes our whole model for understanding how solar system events take place and our spatial awareness of what's going on around us. Here again, we can see another depiction of the winged disc and conveyance of flight. And again, all over Egypt and various places, they used even simple methods to watch as a sundial or track systems of time. Now, a lot of these sites might have been very simple, even to ones that are more complex. The Egyptians went to great lengths also not only tracking these cycles of time, but showed their access or ways that they tracked the right times for them to take either the pharaoh into their next journey or preparing the soul to go into this next phase or next dimension of existence. And a lot of these things, it's interesting, folks, because the Egyptians have a 900-page book called the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The Mayans have similar information where they go to great lengths preparing the pharaoh's knowledge for the afterlife. There's something to this, folks. Now, all of the information we have today, and I'm side noting again, but this is good stuff. There's something to the afterlife experience, near-death experiences. There's someone named Raymond Moody, you can Google him, and near-death experiences where over 400 cases have been analyzed from different hospitals and doctors around the world, having patients describe the same near-death experience. The tunnel of light, out of body, I saw you moving me into the tunnel out of an elevator, you were operating that machine, my mom was coming down here. There's no way they could explain these things. The ancients seem to tap into this near-death experience knowledge much deeper than we do. They prepared the pharaohs and kings for something that seems to be possibly real, folks. I'm going to side dent on it just really quickly because I think it's really cool. I think there's something to the fact that they prepared them to the point where a lot of these tales in the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Mayans' understanding is the king or the pharaoh would essentially be presented with a certain doorway and a being, or challenges that they would have to go through, that if they knew the right answer, they could pass into the next life and have kingship again, meaning be a king in this life and a king in the next. That sounds like a good deal. So a lot of the information, though, has similar lines of information. The mind, for instance, the king would have to go through a room of scorpions and know the right way to navigate, and then a room of tarantulas, things of what have you. But the same analogy for us is on North American Christianity views. It seems to be very heavy that it's good to, let's say, have someone like Jesus. If you're a Christian, as an example, again, I have respect for all religions. I was even raised Christian, but I take no stance to one. I look at all of them as channels of information. The Christian viewpoint is very interesting, where it's like, take Jesus as your savior, because in the next life or the afterlife, he helps guide you, right? So maybe there's something more to this, that a lot of the kings and pharaohs, even today, we're holding on to some piece of a knowledge that the only analogy I could give you is today it's good to have a resume with strong people. It gets you a good job. Well, what if in the afterlife you have strong people that have your back and it helps you get to where you want to go? Jesus is probably a great candidate. The pharaohs and kings seem to also retain and have knowledge of beings and others that they spoke to or asked to watch their back, so that when they transitioned to the afterlife, they had the right phrases, information to speak to them. It's very heavy information, but I think there is some substance to, as our knowledge expands into neurosciences and trying to understand more about this near-death experience that a lot of people have as we, explore what happens when we die. Okay, now getting back on topic, again, a lot of the cultures seem to have this knowledge of astronomical information that just kind of dumbfounds modern astronomers. There are actually tribes in Africa, the Dogon tribe, where they've been tracking astronomical movements of Sirius A and B, a star system, for so long that it just dumbfounds modern astronomers. And it's so accurate that they just can't explain how they have this knowledge. The similarities that they have around Egyptian culture references for the Orion constellation and how they track the movements of the heavens seem to be very much in alignment, even though these cultures were separated by thousands of miles. Now, these people have held on to their cultural beliefs even to this day and have kind of been sheltered from technology, yet they have knowledge that a modern astrophysicist would actually be able to condone and accept. So a lot of the knowledge around this idea that we're a binary solar system raises questions to, well, what's the other candidate of our star system? Is it Sirius A and B that could possibly be this other star system that has, let's say, planets around it, and we're in an orbit with Sirius, so our sun and Sirius are in this dance, and just like there's life around our sun, probably not just Earth, let's get real folks, Mars and other planets, but Sirius A and B, some of its planets might be the origination of some of the life that came here and seeded our solar system. A lot of these cultures are talking about this and have a knowledge of Sirius A and B being the home world for life. So another interesting thing we're looking into for season 9 of Ancient Aliens, which is kind of interesting, this is already part of my lecture, are the Wandjina in Australia. All these references of these beings and different shapes of characters that were explained to resonate all over Australia in this part called the Blue Mountains, and that the Wandjina, these gods, assisted man and flew around the skies of Earth. And even to this day, the Blue Mountain Range, you can Google it, in Australia is a hot spot for UFO activity. So we have to wonder if, there wasn't a time, again, when we were on our higher ages, that cultures were holding on to this knowledge of their interaction with these beings that somehow gave us this great interaction and knowledge. And all over these Aboriginal stones, we see depictions of characters we can't explain. Okay, now also, when we start to look at some of these sites, just like Egypt, we can see just how accurately they've been able to convey a lot of their knowledge. Now, folks, you'll have to forgive me. I believe I started my lecture at 11:30, and I'm going to stop in about 15 minutes to take questions and such. So I might just start speeding through a few of these slides just to convey my meaning.
Just so you know, you have about 45 minutes left, so you can take your time. Yes.
Thank you. I've just been told I have a little bit more time, so I'll slow it down a little bit because I do still have about 120 slides for you folks. Okay, so just understand here that when we also look at the sites like Giza, we can see that it's been very accurately tracked to have an alignment where over time it's drifted, but it seems to happen over time where these alignments take place. The last time Giza was in alignment with Orion was at 10,500 BC. So if the pyramids were built by the Egyptians in 2500 BC, somehow, just like Dendera, right, it's 8,000 years older, showing reliefs of the sky accurately in Dendera, somehow they built the pyramids to align 8,000 years, even before where they're said to have been now at 2500 BC. More than likely, folks, you know, the Egyptian culture goes back much further, or it's piggybacking on cultures that existed in this era since the Golden Age. Let's talk about that, which is probably, you know, 10, 15,000 at most BC. But there's even going to be epochs of time beyond these. We just haven't found them yet. Most of those cultures, I would predict, if there was a betting pool, are going to be found on the southern and Arctic, north and south poles under the ice sheets. Because under pole shifts and times, there's probably lost cultures buried under miles of ice at this point. But all the structures we have today on the surface do show amazing astronomical alignments that go back to around this 10,000 to 13,000 year range, 15,000 max. Giza is a great example aligning to Orion, where when we roll back the clock, it's perfectly aligned at 10,500 BC. Okay, so when we look at some of the math around some of these pyramidal structures, we can see that they're definitely not just out of the box by chance look nice. There's definitely mathematical complexities being shown. Khufu and some of these other pyramids are just so perfectly aligned. They're less than 1 degree off of true north. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. Now, some of the information and tools that we use today to look at the ancient astronaut theory and to date the true origins of these sites, despite modern academics' lack of just using simple tools like this, is to look at Giza as an example. The last time it was like this, meaning all the great tales show the pharaoh walking down the plank of the pyramid and standing at the foot of the Nile, getting on a little boat, going for a cruise, right? If we look at Giza today, we can see that here's the Nile on your right side of your screen, and the pyramids are way over here. Pharaoh's not stepping off onto the Nile. That means that geologically, the time it's taken for the Nile to meander from where the pyramids are all the way over here is thousands of years. That means that there was a time when the Nile, being close to the pyramids, is probably a lot older than what we currently understand today of Pharaoh's existence around 2500 BC. So what we can do, folks, is use geological data like this to say, wow, the river has meandered several miles from where it should have been, and that's a geological change that we can track. Then we can also track the astronomical changes, like you see here, right? Excuse me. Right? So astronomically, we can see when these alignments took place and see, well, why did they align it at that date? And understand that some of these things like this show that the Nile meandering as far as it has is now a geological marker. We can have astrological and geological markers to show the true origins of some of these time frames for when we occupied these sites. Mesoamerica is another example. A lot of these sites around like Machu Picchu or Teotihuacan or Pumapunku that we look at today and are totally in amazement. Well, all of these cultures, here's Lake Titicaca, right? Here's Lake Titicaca. Now look at this. Here's Machu Picchu way up in the corner in Cusco, right? Look at that, folks. Geologically, what do you see? You see an ancient lake bed that unfortunately is a very low lake bed today. But all of those ancient sites, right on the edge of the lake. But that would have been thousands of years ago. So we can use geological data, just like I'm going to show you some on Mars, the same thing applies, that we can look all over the earth, folks, and see that there's been changes geologically that have meandered rivers or shrunken the lake over a period of time that just unfortunately always doesn't stack up with the modern views of these dating periods. Now, if we look over Mesoamerica, over and over we see outposts to monitor the astronomical scene. Various pyramids and structures used for either ceremonial purposes at strategic times, like in Apocalypto. Anyone saw that movie Apocalypto, right? Where the priest at the right time, the painted priest, looks over at the king and he says, okay, you can do your thing. The eclipse is about to happen. They all used posts of ceremony or outposts to monitor things having to do with the movement of the heavens. Now, outside of the movement of the heavens, they went to great lengths to build these structures in a way that would withstand the tests of time. And they used something that we would call a mortarless technology. And all of these stones seem to have been, let's say, superheated. If you take any stone and heat it to the point where it's almost like a magma state, like lava, right? Then it's like putty. You can shape it and move it, maybe pour it into like a mold and let it harden, and then it comes out as a brick. No big deal there, right? Well, folks, that's what we see all over these ancient sites, is the term vitrification. Vitrification is the side effect of once you've had a stone in a liquid, magma, or somewhat magma state, and then you start doing hard cuts, there's this glassing effect on the surface that they call vitrification. So all over these sites like Pumapunku and Machu Picchu and Teotihuacan, we see large cut stones, diorite, basalt, and granite, hard to cut stones with intricate reliefs and patterns cut in them. And the only way to describe that is they were using some type of a large energy source that allowed them to just turn the stone right into putty. And then, as you can see here, if I zoom in, they could literally just, like with laser precision, make poked holes at perfect points in the rock. Now, the only way that you could do this would be that you again had somehow access to technology that would able to superheat the stone. Now, all over Pumapunku and some of these sites, you can see that there's cut stone with intricate patterns that, you just can't imagine someone sitting there with a chisel and not only doing this once, but duplicating it over and over. Let me go back to that one for a minute. So the only thing that we can explain is that they had some type of a large energy source that allowed them to just cut these patterns or heat the stone to the point where they could just press a pattern right into the stone. Outside of that technology, what we also see them applying this heat, the ability to cut the stones, is to what you would call megalithic structures, like you see here. Baalbek in Lebanon is a great example, where we have a quarry site where they were cutting these stones in perfect form, like blocks, and stacking them 5 miles away in Baalbek in Lebanon. We know that they took them here because several of the stones you can see actually cracked off, and so they left it. And just to give you an idea of the size of these stones, you can understand that these are literally trilithotons. They weigh hundreds of tons. I mean, they're huge. We have no ability today to cut a stone of that size out of the ground and transport it in one piece. Maybe we could break it up and transport it, but not as one solid object. And that's exactly what we see, is these stones were cut and then transported till Baalbek is one location. Now, all of the ancient sites seem to have a purpose that was related to the gods. Baalbek is not without reason. There's a great story in the Sumerian epics where King Gilgamesh, when visiting this region, actually described seeing the gods descending and ascending, where he would see large fumes of smoke and fire and thunderous sound as the gods came and went from this location. So Baalbek, before all the cities were built on it, was essentially just a large space platform for landing on. And these stones were essentially the base that still exists today. Now, we still, even today, have megalithic sites built on these locations, but the base was built at a much earlier age. Okay, now a lot of these sites, again, have mathematical constructs built into them, which kind of raise a lot of questions. Stonehenge is no example. They were able to track the motions of the heavens and use this as a system of not only time, but being able to watch when the solstices would occur and understanding the various things that took place in this movement while we were in this binary orbit, or at least being able to understand that there was a tracking of the heavens, and they were able to use this as a marker to track it. Various ways to look at Stonehenge, whether it be based on the sun's angle or the placement of the stones themselves. Now, this speaks to the idea that many of these sites seem to be on what are called ley lines, or a world energy grid of some sort, where they're harnessing electromagnetic upwellings, or there seems to be certain geodetic points where there's more of an upwelling of energy. And a lot of these sites are built to either harness that energy or are at key locations to monitor the heavens from those locations. The Mayans and the Aztecs all over South America are a great example. We see over and over this type of an outpost that would allow them to kind of just, have an unobstructed view of the heavens. And so they went to great lengths in memorializing when certain alignments took place. One of these is kind of infamous around the god Kukulkan, where when the sun hits the angle of this pyramid at the right day and time, we see this great effect where the serpent god is actually memorialized. So here is the pyramid, and then boom, at the right angle of time, we get this effect, where now we have a serpent being displayed coming down the side of the pyramid, all due to just the sun hitting it. That's just amazing. And even to this day, people gather by the thousands, to memorialize this ceremonious event. But I mean, the ability to build this, folks, is, I think, off the charts. Do we see anything like that today, even in modern architecture, where they're utilizing the angles of the sun to, make a creature appear, if you will? It's pretty cool. So when we look at all of these sites, they seem to have a knowledge. Even these sites themselves, these pyramids, were laid out to be known as the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, Pyramid of the Moon. Eric von Daniken believes that these were all laid out in Mexico to actually emulate certain planets in the solar system. But the way they were built is just the same as the Giza pyramids, with mathematical precision that can't just be by chance. And here we go again. So the Pyramid of the Moon, Pyramid of the Sun. And it looks very ceremonial to have like these landing platforms all around this great square. I can almost see like ships sitting on them at some point in the past, perhaps. Just something landing there and easily stepping down. Hello, my people. But we know that all these pyramids, again, were used for ceremonial purposes, and they seem to, again, represent possibly one pyramid for each planet in our known solar system. What's interesting about this is that, again, when we start to look at a lot of these sites in a pulled-back perspective, using Google Maps and satellite views, what we start to see is some interesting comparisons between how the ancients viewed their cultures and how new technology is allowing us to find where they strategically built a lot of their sites. Machu Picchu, Pumapunku, a lot of these sites have, let's just say, a strategic viewpoint. Okay, what's also very interesting about a lot of these sites, again, is the technology and the way they built these sites to just withstand the test of time, mortarless technology. The way that these stones are fit together in such a way, again, the only way they could have done this is with high heat, where they were able to heat these stones and then, again, just perfectly mold them together, as you can see here, a great example. And we see this all over Mesoamerican sites, Peru, Teotihuacan, Machu Picchu, excuse me. So always in representation of their god, either Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl. There's various gods around South America. Interesting thing to note about their gods is, South American people are usually shorter, dark skin, dark hair, yet Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl are all light skinned, either long white hair, long red hair, nowhere near the indigenous people, almost extraterrestrial in nature. So what we also start to see, or I've started to notice, is that there seem to be a conveyance of these gods, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, but many of these other ancient sites seem to be depicting, a race that influenced the great cultures long in the past that they would consider gods or great ancients. And they all seem to have long, slender bodies, and their hands are always wrapped at the waist. And I see this around the world from different cultures, and I'm going to probably come back to that. But could these be representations of this lost ancient culture? Let's call it the Great Atlantean culture, even though it wasn't on one continent. But the great culture that once existed and influenced all the great ancients, they all seem to have a depiction of this long, slender character with their hands wrapped at the waist. Okay, again, more evidence of just these intricately cut stones, even going to locations underwater like Yonaguni and various sites where we can date it again 10, 13,000 years ago. Water levels and things were a lot different. Doesn't mean that there weren't structures, again, right on the coastlines at that time. Unfortunately, now they're probably underwater. India, Asia, a lot of these sites that we're now starting to uncover. One was just did with a partner of mine called Ancient Explorers, was called Dwarka, in India, Dwarka, where there's a huge underwater city right off the coast of India there, as well as here that we see underwater in various sites in Asia, Yonaguni, for example. These are clearly step pyramids of some kind. They still haven't been validated, and again, research around them is kind of not forthcoming or outright. Okay, now again, so when we look at a lot of these newer sites, this is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, we see these depictions of these characters again. Maybe not the best picture, but you can see someone's arm and his hands kind of wrapping into the front here. It's like a long, slender character. All over Göbekli Tepe are these slabs, if you will, kind of sticking out of the ground, and depictions of these long, slender characters. I always found them very interesting, or various animals and things that were available probably in the region at that time. But when we look around the world, we're starting to see, again, a similarity of these long, slender beings. And I say long, slender beings because here, even on the remotest area on Earth, Easter Island, we have, again, the same type of a being being depicted. What we thought were just heads, which we call the moai heads, are actually not just heads. When excavated, are long, slender beings with their hands wrapped at the waist. This, unfortunately, is a back view of him, but he's actually got his hands wrapped at the waist. So there seems to be a lost epoch of time of understanding when these different beings were around. And it's probably not that they were entirely human, but they might have been not alien in the sense that they were Terra-based, but maybe not entirely human. And I just want to go back to this analogy, not the best, some of the hieroglyphics or images they have here are more animal symbols on the actual figures. But I want to just go back to that example of the mayfly. We live such a short duration of time, 100 years. It's very hard to gauge what the ancients were telling us around this information in understanding that we live 100 years out of a 24,000 year cycle that seems to be repeating here on Earth. Now I'm going to kind of touch on some modern topics as the last part of my lecture. Mars has obviously been in the news with the movie The Martian and some of the things they released out right around the same time of The Martian, saying, hey, look, we found water on Mars and some of the precursors for life on Mars. I think what we're going to find is a continual proliferation of evidence around Mars. This was some of the first information that I became interested in, and I've been tracking the movements of Mars for quite a long time as far as what we've been doing there. Over the last couple decades, other agencies, ESA, the Chinese, have also engaged in sending craft to Mars and are watching what's going on. What's really interesting about the imagery and things that we receive telemetry-wise from Mars is that still 80% of this goes through one company based in San Diego called Malin Space Science Systems, meaning Dr. Mike Malin is the principal science photographer licensing the technology to NASA to use for the orbital cameras. So all of the imaging processing goes through his departments, classified in most parts, but the public sectors as well. Well, when I was attending college in San Diego, I contacted Dr. Mike Malin and asked him point blank range as a college student about Cydonia, the face and pyramids, and he told me, oh, these are all natural objects, nothing to do with artificial intelligence or some ancient culture. So I've been paying attention over the last 20 years since I was in college and asked him those questions, and have noticed a track record of how we're slowly building up this information to release to the public. Now, it's not that there's a cover-up at NASA. There's been an engineer at NASA working there for 16 years, and he developed an arm that's going to go on the next orbiter, and it's going to dip into the dirt and look for amino acids, right? So he's building a science project or an objective around that. We don't have any instrumentation going on any of the orbiters or landers that's going to actually scoop up some life and confirm. So there's a political backup to us actually confirming life. But let's be clear, folks, there's also a cover-up too. I just want to be clear about that. Okay, so you can see that for a long time we've been looking at Mars, even since Schiaparelli, where he said there's canali all over Mars, right? Waterways all over Mars. No, there's no waterways all over Mars. That's exactly what he was seeing. Mars today is exactly what Schiaparelli thought in the late 1800s, is that it's actually inundated with a lot of an ancient, at one point was probably teeming with life. So the evidence that we have today on Mars is slowly coming out that there's still something going on Mars, which allows us for quite a bit of evidence to say, yes, there's probably life today. Now, NASA has been photographing the surface of Mars for quite a long time. Some of these newer agencies have just got into the game. And we can see here, ESA, the European Space Agency, takes their images in color. And this one patch called the Gusev crater, you can see, which looks very much possibly like vegetation. Now, NASA takes the same swath of the Gusev crater and shows you this in black and white. ESA, this. NASA, this. NASA won't acknowledge that this is actually vegetation of some sort, but if you go through the NASA archives, we start to find some very interesting data, folks. All over the surface of Mars, there are patches of standing water, standing vegetation, some type of plant life, whether it's bacterial-based or chlorophyll-based, I don't know. But as you're going to see, there is life in that form all over Mars. And even since the 70s, here's snow from the Viking orbiter in the 70s, snow all over the surface of Mars. And all of the images that you see of Mars being super red, the images that we take from the surface of Mars are taking a larger spectrum of light than what the human eye can see. If you color correct it for RGB of what the eye sees, this, behind this live press conference, is what the actual eye would see on Mars. Very rarely do they color correct it for you. It's just a red planet. No, it's a blue, just like kind of more like us. They just have a much weaker atmosphere. That's what Mars looks like if you're standing on the surface. So all over Mars, we're starting to find out that there's a very watery past, even salt water, standing salt water all over the surface of Mars. Here's a clear satellite image of standing water on Mars right now. Here's a lake on Mars right now. If you think I'm joking, folks, I'm not. What's funny about this is that if you pair this up to a Google map and look at a lake bed from a satellite view, it doesn't look much different from Earth than from Mars. But folks, these are all standing water with some type of, I would assume, chlorophyll-based, bacterial-based plant life collecting around these pools of water. And so here's a comparison of what you would see from Google Maps and also on Mars. And that is literally from the surface of Mars, and most of these images can be found in any of the Malin Space Science Systems archives. So over and over again, I find these images of what appear to me to be literally pools of water on Mars and vegetation growing around these locations. And some of these sites on the surface of Mars almost represent what if you maybe brushed away the dirt and took some tractors out there or something. To me, it looked like the same Google Maps view of Inca cities here on Earth. Maybe there's some type of connection. But a lot of these sites under Google Maps view can be compared to satellite imagery of Mars and seeing that there is some type of connection or similarity to these locations. So all over Mars, we have what appear to be not just random things, but if you look closer at this cliffside, you can see that there could be small edifices or things that are pharaonic in nature, or just like there's things here in Egypt of pyramids and a large sculpted face into the Sphinx. Maybe all over Mars, we will find these types of artifacts and connections as well. And there does seem to be a connection between what we see with the lion-esque views of the Sphinx edifice and a lot of the pyramidal structures, and finding these same types of things in a region on Mars called Cydonia. Here in Egypt, we can see in one area of Abydos, they have these wall reliefs, which are still under scrutiny as being older reliefs covering up newer reliefs. So these aren't really a helicopter and spaceships, but maybe they are. All of the ancients have these conveyances of the actual gods traveling between the planets. Now, here's an actual conveyance of one god of Earth, the 7 dots and the crescent moon, the god of Earth, using the winged disc, a conveyance of flight, conveying to the fish god on Mars, or the conveyance of a man on Mars. So it's very interesting. And you can see below them, there's this dolphin symbol in the lower part of the tablet. These are actually shown as symbolic references on various parts of Mars on the ground. So these references from the Sumerian culture, having the ability for the references of the power of flight, I don't think it's just a symbolic reference to say that, you know, they had wings. I think it's to say that they literally had the power of flight. And so a lot of that is being shown in not only Earth-based artifacts, but some of these locations as we start to send probes and things to the other planets, look into these dark craters. Who knows what we're going to find? I kind of like to allude to that movie, Stargate, where we kind of find the Stargate and jet to another dimension. I guess only time's going to tell. But the Sphinx, as you can see, was once very much buried up. And only recently, over the last, since our lifetime, 60, 70 years, that we uncovered it and kind of opened it up for history to appreciate. But there's still quite a bit of history out there that we have yet to uncover. And you can look on Google Maps and see sites, even in Giza, around Giza, that have yet to be excavated. So quite interesting. Now, if you look at the geological evidence of the inner walls of the Sphinx, you can see massive erosion. There's been massive amounts of erosion that have been, happening on the inner walls of the Sphinx. So this could have only taken place with massive amounts of rain or water gushing over the sides of the walls. And the last time there were rains like that was probably the Great Flood 10,000 years ago. So more than likely, the Sphinx again is a much older edifice. The pyramids as well. And again, under satellite analysis, we can see that their alignments and things are just way too much of a precision to have been just by chance aligning to the Orion constellation. And other cultures seem to reference this as well, where they take the Orion constellation's knowledge and create monuments on the ground that seem to be emulating this constellation for some reason. Now, a few scholars have done quite a bit of work at looking at these ancient cultures. I'd like to at least acknowledge them. Zachariah Sitchin, also Graham Hancock, looking at more of the Egyptian connection, looking at the astronomical connections, both great scholars. I think as we continue to look at Mars, we're in for quite a bumpy ride of information. This will probably be the first location where they validate life other than Earth existing. I think everyone that's familiar with the Cydonia region can see that there's an area on Mars that was once occupied. And when we look at this a little bit closer, you can see that this is something that hasn't been called out. But if you look at where the face is and these structures that I've labeled pyramidal structure and fort and pyramidal structure down at the bottom, you notice that the image, just pull back and look at the image on your screen for a moment. The left side is bright, knobby terrain, and the right side mellows out to where the face is to more mellow, non-knobby terrain. Almost as if you look at where the terrain change between that left and right side is, you can see an ancient shoreline. And that's exactly what it is, folks. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But all of these structures are not only positioned towards each other in the right way, they were actually positioned in such a way that the culture at that time was able to appreciate them mathematically, but also visually. Richard Hoagland did a great job. There's a couple of videos you can probably get on Netflix or on Apple TV, where he really gets into the math behind the Cydonia region and looking at not only the face, but the surrounding structures around these various objects. And some, believe that there is literally this ancient city on Mars known as Cydonia. Now, what I've really found interesting, as I mentioned, is that these structures appear to be right on an ancient shoreline, where if you look at this closely, you can see these objects that look to be pyramids are positioned right on what would be an ancient shoreline. And the face would be out in the water like a monument. I mean, it's very much today like how everyone likes to live on waterfront property. We can see a clear geological delineation between the land and the water side, right down the middle of the image, making it to be some type of an ancient shoreline. And the land seems to encompass all of those structures. So it makes sense, right? Like even today, everyone likes to live on waterfront property. So it's very possible that Cydonia was built, thank you so much, was built, here, let me take this, was built in such a way so that you're able to actually see things from the land, just like we have like the Washington Monument or the Statue of Liberty surrounded by water. Okay, now I'm going to start to wrap it up here, folks, but my point around the face is that, you know, NASA took this picture in the early 70s with the Viking orbiter. On the live feed, they labeled this image that you see here in raw data as head and said, oh, it's a trick of light and shadow. A few hours later, we imaged this with the satellite, and the shadow was gone. It was no longer a face. Wrong answer. It turns out that not only was this face imaged by different satellite passes, but at different sun angles, it still always looks like a face. And here's the worst picture they ever took of the face, and watch the data that I'm able to extract from it. If you take the worst image that they took from the Mars Global Surveyor in 1998, Art Bell, a famous radio talk show host, called this the cat box image. It looks like a cat just scratched up the face. But if you take this image and rotate it so that it's looking at you head on, split it down the middle, you actually get some really interesting data. Now, one side that's really badly eroded, you can still see facial features. But that left side, if we take that and mirror it, just like any human face, if you look at yourself in half a mirror, you still look like yourself because we're asymmetrical. Well, this isn't by chance, folks, that what we're seeing on the face on Mars is asymmetrical features on just that left side that's less eroded that are just not found in nature, right? We see Egyptian headdress. We see what looks like lion-like facial features. We see a symmetrical face having eyes, nose, and a mouth. This just can't be by chance. So I think a lot of these things, when we look at the face and pyramids under higher scrutiny, we can see that they actually do pass a lot of these scientific tests, like looking at it from any three-dimensional angle. There's another gentleman who I'd highly recommend outside of Dr. Richard Hoagland, outside of Richard Hoagland, is a gentleman named Dr. Mark Carlotto, who is an imaging specialist and wrote algorithms to look at satellite telemetry, where you run his algorithm on a satellite image of Russia, and he could tell you, oh, those are troops being hidden by patterns, you know, or those are tanks being covered up by a tarp. So when he ran his mathematical algorithms on the face and pyramids, the face and pyramids all came out as hits to be over 98% probability to be artificial. So all of that mathematical fractal analysis that he could prove on satellite telemetry from Russia worked the same way as it did on the face and pyramids on Mars. NASA never came forth with any of this type of data. Yet anyone can do the analysis for themselves, as I did, that there's enough evidence in the public sector from good researchers like Dr. Mark Carlotto to validate that there is an artificial intelligence that has somehow left a marker on Mars, let alone here on Earth. I mean, we're looking at Mars and trying to figure stuff out. We got stuff all over our own planet. So just kind of wrapping it up there, Mark Carlotto's information is definitely a great source of information to look at when trying to validate further missions as we go to Mars and understanding how we can hold accountable NASA and these space agencies. NASA has had quite a long duration of protocols since its inception, since the Brookings report released its report about what do we do if we find aliens. You know, they've always mandated quarantine. That's not always the best procedure. I think it's more going to be up to us as the public sector starts to find new ways through SpaceX launch, successful launch today, and various other drone technology we're going to start to send into the solar system. It's going to be a little bit harder over the next decade for the Department of Defense to lock out public access to the solar system. So stay tuned, folks. We're definitely in for an interesting ride as some of these old standing traditions change. And maybe as we eventually go to Mars, we're going to find things there that make us realize we have a much richer history. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there, and I'll spend unfortunately, since we went kind of long here, I'm going to spend about 5 minutes, and I'll look at your comments or coordinate with Neil to answer anything that I can. Thank you so much, folks. I hope this was helpful for you.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much for that. There were a couple of questions that came in. Any information on the planet of Nibiru? Anything come up in your studies?
Yes, so basically the planet Nibiru or Planet X is something that's widely been talked about on the internet. Unfortunately, there hasn't really been a lot of new data looking for that specific size of a planet talked about by the ancients, which is about 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. We've only been finding things like Sedna, Quoar, Xena, which are around 800 to 1,000 miles or 1,000 kilometers. So they're big floating ice balls. They demoted Pluto, which I don't agree with. The Nibiru we're looking for is 4 to 8 times the size of Earth, folks. Anything that large, the amateur astronomers around the world are going to see anything like that size well before it comes anywhere near us. In my opinion, it's not been hiding out behind the sun for like 10 years. It's not on a collision course near us at any time soon. But let's just wait and see.
And also, I wanted to ask Jason, what are some ways, we've been asking this a lot, that participants can take part in getting this type of information out in terms of disclosure? What are some ways we can help you get this information? Are there people we can write? Are there any tips you can give us? How do we have disclosure happen from the people, by the people?
You know, the best thing, Neil, I think is more of a grassroots movement. There are certain people that are driven to be interested in these topics, and you want to share it with your friends and family, and it's sometimes very difficult to breach those barriers of communication. Stick with it. Listen to these conferences, immerse yourself in the knowledge, and I encourage people to arm themselves with facts. Like earlier when I'm talking about the binary solar system, well, you need to Google Binary Research Institute and see that there's a plethora of mathematical data, but then also easy to interpret concepts around this knowledge. So people just need to step up on however you can. Neil is an example. I put my hat out to him for doing the conference. Certain people are interested in these topics. Certain people feel obligated to step up and be involved in these topics, however you can. So my advice to you is, if you feel obligated to spread the word of these topics, do it in ways where you have to be logical, meaning if you're going to try and pierce someone's envelope of interest, use things that are academically acceptable. Let them chew on it and make up their own decision. Anything else I can answer? One more question? Okay, great. Well, Neil, thank you so much for the conference. I really appreciate it, and I hope everything continues down the path with today's events.
Yeah, thank you so much. All the information and your presentation was phenomenal. It's always good visually to see everything. So I'm sure everyone got a lot of information from that. And thank you again just for all your service and all your work you're doing. You know, from us to you, it's really great to be of service and having all the information you're doing, Jason. Lots of great information. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for attending, guys. I see all of your comments on the chat, guys. Take care. I'll be appearing at a plethora of conferences this year, so hope to see you in person there at one of them. Take care.
Excellent. And shout out to Ancient Aliens.
Thanks. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.